Hi guys. I know it's been a minute, but it took me a little bit of studying and linking multiple different texts together because today we're going to talk about Genesis chapter 6 and the actual reason for the flood. So, so first of all, just to situate this within our wider study on this channel, obviously, we went over the purpose and mission of humanity, which is to be God's imagers, to representatively rule on His behalf, directing all allegiance and worship to Yahweh as the God of all gods. Then we covered what's commonly known as the fall, even though, as you can tell, we're approaching this a little bit differently, a little bit more like an ancient Israelite would, and like a lot of the biblical authors actually do, and that is that there are three falls, if you will, in Genesis, and they're Genesis chapter 3, Genesis chapter 6, and Genesis chapter 11. Today, we're going to cover the second of these three rebellions in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Just going to go ahead and read those off real quick. When man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. And you know what? I'm going to go ahead and read these next few verses too. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things, and the birds of heaven, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So we hear a lot about, or maybe we don't, but I just remember growing up in a couple of different churches hearing about Noah and the flood fairly often. I think that Noah and the flood is kind of a story that even a lot of secular people are familiar with, enough to know generally what you're talking about. But here we have this pretty strange stuff in Genesis 6, 1 through 4, talking about how the sons of God, Hebrew B'nai Elohim, essentially procreate with human women and have giant children called Nephilim. And then the verses that we're more familiar with, the beginning of the flood narrative as we think of it, is this whole, the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, but Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So we think of it as, man just got so evil that God essentially, and what you have in verses 5 through 8 are actually, and you can see from the language here in verse 7, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land. That's the pinnacle of God's creation, right? His representative rulers. And animals and creeping things and the birds of heaven. So that's the same language as Genesis 1, when God created everything. So the purpose of this is to say that the flood is an act of decreation. And God, being good like he is and creating a good creation to begin with, we know that there will also be an act of recreation after that. But when you think of the flood, you shouldn't just think, oh, well, things got bad, so God's like kind of hit the reset button. To think of, in a little bit more biblical terms, we should be thinking of this as not just like a reset because things are bad, so we got to get them good, but more like God created a good creation in the beginning, which is what it says after God created or set creation in order, is that he called it good after he created it. So God's created order is good, and he's not going to give up on it, and he's not going to throw it in the trash can because somebody didn't cooperate or somebody rebelled, or, which, as we're going to see, happens over and over again, right? But so think of this in terms of decreation, recreation, and the reason for this not just being human beings got bad on their own, which within the context of the narrative, you should be thinking, even if you're just thinking in human terms, you should still be thinking about Adam, the sin of Adam and Eve, opening the door to let sin and death in to God's good creation, right? I don't want to say to not make it good, but obviously kind of throws a monkey wrench into things, right? And that's why justification is needed, right? And when you get into the New Testament and you see Paul's language of justification, this is going to be another thing where I'm getting way ahead of myself, but I know a lot of people read and are a lot more familiar with the New Testament than they are the Old Testament, not really realizing that everything in the New Testament comes from the Old Testament. So if we don't know the Old Testament, we really don't know anything about the New Testament. And that may draw some heat, but go ahead and bring it in the comments if you have a problem with that statement. I'm more than willing to back it up. So anyway, back to the point there, though. Paul's use of justification in the New Testament is actually a lot more about setting creation right, in the sense that we talked about it in Genesis 1. Humans, of course, being kind of the crown jewel, the pinnacle of that creation. And obviously, sin and death, through God's good ordered creation out of order, at least in certain ways, very important and destructive ways. And once again, God not abandoning his good plan for his good creation and just throwing it in the trash can for some sort of, and this is what we commonly hear is God's plan, right? Is to save sinners' souls so that when we die, our disembodied spirits can float up into heaven. Well, that's not at all biblical, number one. Once again, if you'd like to challenge, please post in the comments. We can have that discussion about heaven and disembodied spirits and what the Christian hope really is. But that's not at all what God does. Man, I'm getting so far from justification again. I'm sorry, guys. So what God's plan is to set his entire creation back into order, and he's going to do that by getting rid of, not humans, that would defeat the whole purpose, right? But to get rid of sin and death, and therefore save humans. not just disembodied spirits so that they can float up into some place in the space-time universe called heaven, as if that's a thing. And it's more about, one, ridding the creation of sin and death so that humans can do what God created them to do, which is to image him, ruling wisely on his behalf like he would rule, taking care of the creation as God would take care of it, directing all allegiance and worship to Yahweh. And God hasn't given up on that. So when we look at things in the New Testament and we look at St. Paul talking about justification, and that's what's needed for human beings to be saved, and we'll talk a lot more about what saved in the scriptures actually means, because I know I'm going hard at this and this isn't really the point of Genesis 6. Promise I'll get back on track, but isn't about disembodied spirits going to heaven when you die. The point of justification is being set right in the sense of, in the context of God's good ordered creation. And in order to do that, God's going to get rid of the powers of sin and death that keep us from our divine task of imaging, which once again, I brought it up in the Genesis 1 video, but Paul's stated problem in Romans is the famous verse in chapter 3, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. That is, all have fallen short of their divine task given by God, that they image him, that they reflect his glory into the world, that they direct all worship and allegiance to Yahweh as the God of all gods, and that they rule on his behalf like he would rule, because that's what we were created to do. And God's going to get us back to that one day. So sorry for that long aside on justification and what it actually means. And just so you know that this isn't just something where, I think different than Martin Luther. You're more than welcome to get on podcasts. Podcasts are free. They're an excellent resource as long as you know who is actually legitimate. And who you should actually be listening to, as opposed to some of these yahoos that are out there that don't know what they're talking about. But please, like I've been suggesting, get on the Lord of Spirits podcast, get on the Whole Counsel of God podcast. I know both of these are orthodox, so I'm showing a little bit of favoritism here, but that's the Orthodox teaching on justification. The Orthodox don't argue back and forth on justification. I know in Protestant circles it's kind of a big deal, and this is going to be one of those things where I kind of bring you up to date on things in scholarship. Even though this debate is fairly old now, it was going on when I was first in college for biblical studies. But just going to bring to your attention that there was a pretty big debate within the Protestant evangelical theological realm, I guess you might say, between John Piper, who represents more of a Calvinist Reformed camp, and N.T. Wright, was an Anglican bishop. He's getting older now, so I think he's kind of cut back on some of his, he used to have a lot of titles and responsibilities, and anyway, that's neither here nor there. Piper and Wright argued quite a bit concerning the meaning of justification. N.T. Wright wrote a book, which I believe I have right there, titled Justification. It's an excellent book. I think Wright's treatment and exegesis is a lot better than Piper's. This is just my personal opinion now, and we can argue about that if you want to too. All in good fun and in good faith, because not condemning anyone obviously for having the wrong view of justification, but even N.T. Wright, I think, could benefit from the Orthodox view of justification. even though I think his treatment is better than, say, someone like Piper's, who believes in imputed righteousness. And we're going to get to all that when we get to Romans. It'll be a great time. But all that long aside on justification about being creation set right, in a video about Genesis 6 doesn't really belong, so back to Genesis 6. I'm sorry, guys. Want to point out some things about Genesis 6, 1 through 4, now that I'm finally back to it. When man began to multiply is a reference to the dominion mandate. So what we're going to see in these 3 divine rebellions in Genesis is that all of them, what makes them a rebellion, is that they're against the dominion mandate. So these rebellions aren't just, I'm trying to put into words how I was taught about sin and these rebellions growing up, which I really wasn't taught about the Genesis 6 and hardly any about the rebellion at Babel in Genesis 11. We're almost exclusively, as Protestants, I think, taught that Genesis 3 is the source of all of humankind's problems. And don't get me wrong, Adam and Eve's sin opened the door for sin and death. But we really don't see until the next chapter Cain actually being dominated, being dominated by the power of sin, and sin actually taking control or having its way with Cain, resulting in the first murder and the first human violence. And then, of course, we have this genealogy in between, kind of clues us in on where things went from sin actually getting in the world and taking hold of humans. And then we have this in Genesis 6, where essentially sin takes hold of all humanity that existed in the time, with the exception of Noah and his family. And also, the point, I think, of Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is that this is a divine rebellion. So notice again in Genesis 3, Adam and Eve sometimes, they take a lot of flack for being the first humans that sinned, they messed up, they couldn't follow one rule, whatever. Some of that, don't get me wrong, is obviously true and fair, but some of that is really not fair, because you should see when you read the narrative of Genesis 3 that the serpent really is the bad guy of the story. Now, the serpent initiated all of this. The serpent is the one that had an evil motive. Eve did not have an evil motive when she obeyed the serpent. She thought, oh, well, this is one of my spirit being family members in the garden. Another Elohim. Obviously in God's good garden. It says all the trees were good for eating and beneficial. So the temptation to be more like God, which is what the serpent was like, oh, hey, you'll be more like God if you do this. Eve had a good intention. She wanted to be more like God. Now, obviously, there's multiple things wrong with that, and I'm not trying to totally get you to, oh, well, Adam and Eve were faultless. They obviously weren't. God let them reap the consequences for their bad decisions, for their not doing their divine task of imaging and subduing creation under the rule and reign of God, the kingdom of God. And they obeyed something else with a different agenda other than God. That's how they got in a bad situation. But But I just want you to see that the serpent is the one that initiated this. And in Genesis 6, the whole initiation of sin coming in and taking hold of all of mankind, the language is pretty extreme here. The wickedness of man was great in the earth, and every intention of the thoughts of his heart were only evil continually. Like, that's complete dominion of sin over humanity. But 6:1-4 precedes that, and it's the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God, that kick this off. And I know 6:1-4 don't give us a lot of information, but let's go ahead and hit these next 3 points I've got on it. Verse 2, sons of God. Here are divine beings, not sons of Adam or Seth. For a full argument about this, please, it's worth the money, pick up the book The Unseen Realm by Michael Heiser. It contains a full argument against what's called the Sethite view, that these are just sons of Seth. Once again, don't really have the time, we're already 21 minutes in, to go through the Sethite view and why it's wrong. But Michael Heiser does a really good job of not strawmanning that argument, but giving it in the full force of, well, probably even better than most people who could present the Sethite view to you. It's a very common view, but a very errant view of Genesis 6. And they don't just do it in Genesis 6, so people that believe in the Sethite view will also export it out to especially like Psalm 82, which we'll cover more in following episodes. But so please do yourself a favor, spend the little bit of money, and it's well worth it. Just get The Unseen Realm, read it, and let your life be changed for the better. Verse 4, the products of this unholy union of man and gods are the Nephilim, the giants, also called the men of renown. And perhaps the most famous of these are Goliath, right? So if you believe in the story of David and Goliath, the necessary precursor for believing that story is valid at all, and not just Goliath was like, the size of an NFL football player or an NBA basketball player. If you believe Goliath was more than that, then you essentially have to believe this narrative in Genesis 6:1-4, because that's where giants, the Nephilim, also referred to as the Rephaim, later in Scripture, and we'll talk about that differentiation later. The whole precursor for that is that these are, these are the product of the rebellion against humanity's dominion mandate. So what I mean by that is, this rebellion is a complete hijacking of humanity's dominion mandate by the B'nai Elohim. The sons of God. The sons of God see, and don't get me wrong, obviously there's an element of this presented in the narrative that they see the beauty of human women, and so essentially they're tempted to lust and to take what is not theirs. And we'll cover that a little more when we cover some New Testament passages that talk about this and get into 1st Enoch. But the Nephilim are the product of this hijacking of the dominion mandate. So the dominion mandate, of course, is that humanity is to be fruitful and multiply, which the sons of God do here, right? They're fruitful and multiply with human women. That they fill the earth and subdue it. That's the part of this where the earth is filled with wickedness and violence because of this. So instead of humanity going and spreading the rule and reign of God, which is wise and loving and good. These giants, the Nephilim, the men of renown, go through the earth taking dominion through force. Might makes right. We're just going to storm in there and kill anybody in our path. And you can see this later in the Old Testament narrative about the conquest, about the people of God encountering the giant people of the land. Once again, after Moses led the Exodus, this is why the Israelites did not want to take the land that God had promised them, because they were afraid of these giant people. They were like, they'll squish us like bugs, essentially. And then they would. I mean, they were giant, violent people. Essentially just like their fathers created them to be. So, just want you to see how it's a hijacking of the dominion mandate. That's what makes this a divine rebellion. The other thing, obviously, this is the first corporate rebellion of divine beings. There is no corporate rebellion of divine beings before this. So, Milton's Paradise Lost, get that out of your head. There is no rebellion of angels. There is no war in heaven. There is nothing. There is no divine rebellion with multiple divine beings happening before this. This is the first divine rebellion of a group, like a corporate rebellion of divine beings. So, verse 4, I want you to notice the mighty men will later be contrasted with David's mighty men, who were, as Hebrew, Gibborim of Yahweh, that finished the conquest against the giants. So, sorry, spoiler alert, who ends up finishing off the giants and the products of this rebellion are David and his mighty men, or his, in the Hebrew, David's Gibborim, which are Yahweh's mighty men. So, anyway, if you've ever read the narrative of the mighty men, that's actually the point. It's not like, oh, these are great warriors, you should take up the sword and be a great warrior like them. It's not like that at all. The point of it is the rebellious divine beings had their mighty men, and they went forth and filled the earth with violence and sin. And God raised up David as his king, once again, his representative ruler on earth. You should see that. And his mighty men, his Gibborim, and they make war. And David and his mighty men clear out the remnants of the giants, so the giants are no more. Except for their disembodied spirits become demons. And that's what demons and unclean spirits are in the New Testament. But anyway, so once again, another spoiler. So I'm going to read Genesis 6, 11 through 13, and then we'll cover how Jewish people treated this later, both in the Bible and in extra-biblical literature. So Genesis 6, 11, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. And then there's the command to make the ark. So, this corruption and violence are not disconnected from the wider narrative. Later Jewish writers thought that this corruption and violence was the direct and purposeful result of the sin of the Watchers, which is another name for the Bnei Elohim, or the sons of God. What Daniel and the book of Enoch, because Daniel, once again, is where these sons of God are referred to as the Watchers. This is what they refer to as the sons of God. So, when you hear Watchers and sons of God, all I'm trying to say there is that you should associate the two, because that's where the term Watchers comes from. It's to refer to these divine beings, known as the sons of God in Hebrew. So, I'll read a couple of passages. from Charles Worth's Old Testament pseudepigrapha. So, some people are afraid to read stuff like this. You shouldn't be. Now, you shouldn't read this and not read this. Obviously, read this first and know what it means. But this quotes some things in this, so it's probably pretty good to read this to see, how these guys are using these guys. But we're going to do a little bit of that today, or I'm going to do it for you in kind of a safe place where I'm not a heretic and I'm not trying to get you to disobey God or not do the things in this book. In fact, the whole purpose of me doing this channel and teaching the things in this book are to try to get you to direct all of your worship and all of your allegiance to Yahweh as the God of all gods, Jesus is the King of all kings, and the power of the Holy Spirit. So there you go. There's my Trinitarian formula for obeying and being faithful to God. So we want to do all of the good things that God tells us to do in the scriptures. So once again, reading this to support and help us better understand this and how later authors are going to use Genesis 6, 1 through 4, and how they're going to use things like this. So once again, 1 Enoch, chapter 6. And I'm going to read 1 through 6. To start with, in those days when the children of man had multiplied, it happened that there were born unto them handsome and beautiful daughters. And the angels, children of heaven, saw them and desired them. And they said to one another, Come, let us choose wives for ourselves from the daughters of man, and beget us children. And I'm going to butcher this, I'm sorry. People that know Hebrew better than me are going to be like, dude, you butchered that. But anyway, so... And Semyaz, which I believe some people say Shemihazah or something like that. But anyway, being their leader, said unto them, I fear that perhaps you will not consent that this deed should be done, and I alone will become responsible for this great sin. But they all responded to him, Let us all swear an oath and bind everyone among us by a curse, not to abandon this suggestion, but to do the deed. And they all swore together and bound one another by the curse. And they were together 200. And they descended into Ardos, which is the summit of Hermon. So that's Mount Hermon, and it's talked about in the Bible. In fact, another spoiler alert, when Jesus tells Peter and the disciples, not taking the Catholic interpretation on that, by the way. Sorry. When I said to Peter, I was like, oh no, now people are going to think I'm a papist. Anyway, so I'm not a papist, and I'm not a Catholic. Don't hate Catholics. Got good Catholic brothers and sisters out there. If you don't believe that Catholics are Christians, you need to rethink that. Anyone that swears Jesus Christ is Lord and serves him faithfully is a brother, regardless of whether or not they believe in papal authority. And anyway, not getting into that, sorry. So, Mount Hermon, when Jesus makes the statement that upon this rock I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And this is Dr. Michael Heiser's view. This is not just my view. I didn't just pull this out of nowhere. But Heiser's view that he puts forth is that the rock isn't Peter, though that's possible too. I'm not telling you have to believe one interpretation of this. I will say, when Christ said this, though, they were at the foot of Mount Hermon. And Christ said the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. A couple of things about that real quick. Obviously, we're not in it right now, but I'm going to give it to you anyway. Gates are a defensive structure. So saying that gates will not prevail against the church means that the church is on the attack. So, And once again, Jesus being at the foot of Mount Hermon, the site of where the Watchers came down and started their rebellion, is literally Jesus going to their gates and knocking on the door saying, hey, we're here to take it back. Like, we're here to set things right and defeat you. So Jesus was calling out the powers of darkness when he says this. And he's also saying that the church's offensive assault against the powers of darkness will not be stopped. Yeah, so we're going to run them over. But anyway, so I read 6, 1 through 4. A couple other little passages I want to read. So chapter 7, don't worry, it's 6 verses. And I'll read chapter 8 as well, which is only another 4 verses. So 1 Enoch chapter 7 and 8. And they took wives unto themselves, and everyone respectively chose one woman for himself, and they began to go unto them, and they taught them magical medicine, incantations, cutting of roots, and taught them about plants. And the women became pregnant and gave birth to great giants, whose heights were 300 cubits. These giants consumed the produce of all the people, until the people detested feeding them. So the giants turned against the people in order to eat them. And they began to sin against the birds. Sorry, quick note about the people, the giants eating people. If you're an anime fan, and you've watched Attack on Titan, you can't read this passage and not think about it. Anyway, sorry, nerd moment. If you're not a nerd and you don't like anime, please ignore that. And don't hate me for knowing about that. So the giants turned against the people in order to eat them, and they began to sin against birds, wild beasts, reptiles, and fish. Not 100% sure what that means. And their flesh was devoured by one another, and they drank blood. Bet that's what that means. Okay. And then the earth brought an accusation against the oppressors. So this may be akin to when Cain killed Abel and Abel's blood cried out from the grave. The earth brought an accusation against the oppressors. Or it could be, like in the Old Testament, it talks about certain sins. Once again, and the drinking of blood and the committing of sexual immorality and idol worship are all sins that apparently are in some sense against the land, and they pollute the land, and the land apparently will reject humans. And we'll get into all what that means another time, but just know that in Acts chapter 15, when the apostles decide what parts of the Old Testament law Gentile Christians had to obey, it's only 4 things. And those 4 things are the 4 things that the Old Testament law says the land will vomit you out if you commit these sins. Anyway, so chapter 8, wow, my family is loud today. And Azazel taught the people the art of making swords, knives, shields, and breastplates. And he showed to their chosen ones bracelets, decorations, shadowing of the eye with antimony, ornamentation, beautifying of the eyelids, precious kinds of stones, coloring of tinctures, and alchemy. And there were many wicked ones, and they committed adultery and erred, and their conduct became corrupt. Amasaris, once again, sorry if I'm butchering that, taught incantation and the cutting of roots, and Armoros, the resolving of incantations, and Barachial, astrology, and Kokoril, the knowledge of the signs, and Tamael taught the seeing of the stars, and Astarel taught the course of the moon, as well as the deception of man. And the people cried, and their voice reached unto heaven. So, just trying to show you several things about this. So chapter 7 pretty much gives us the note in Genesis 6, 11 through 13 about the earth being filled with violence. Obviously, the giants attacking and eating people and drinking the blood of animals is all pretty extreme and crazy and violent and evil. And then you have in chapter 8 all the sins that they taught the people. So this accounts for all of humanity coming under the dominion of sin, and every thought of humanity's collective mind essentially became evil. It became evil because these divine beings taught them the art of seduction, the art of war. So, oh, hey, here's how to commit sexual immorality, and here's how to kill each other in droves. Not to mention the really strange bits about incantations and spells and alchemy and all kinds of weird stuff that we modern people don't even think is real. But anyway, I'm going to skip to 9, verses 1 through 9, and read those. Once again, all of these are going to pertain to Jewish understanding, and that includes biblical authors, especially Peter and Jude, and even the reference to demons, unclean spirits in the New Testament. So bear with me here. I know this is kind of some strange stuff, some stuff you've never heard before, but it does affect how New Testament authors believed their world was, what was going on in the spiritual realm, and therefore that's why they wrote some of the things that they wrote, which we'll get to later. Then Michael, Seraphel, oh Lord, I'm butchering that, and Gabriel observed carefully from the sky, and they saw much blood being shed upon the earth, and all the oppression being wrought upon the earth. And they said to one another, the earth, from her empty foundation, has brought the cry of their voice unto the gates of heaven. So once again, this is like Abel's blood crying out from the grave. And now, holy ones of heaven, the souls of the people are putting their case before you, pleading, bring our judgment before the Most High. Quick note there, so there's a passage in Revelation pretty early on about the souls of the martyrs being under the altar and crying out to God, how long before you set things right, before you bring justice and judgment upon the evildoers that killed us. And something about this real quick is the altar in the Old Testament, where they would extract the blood from the sacrificial animal. That blood had to go somewhere, and they had to be careful what they did with it. Obviously, they were strictly commanded not to drink of it, and they couldn't eat of the sacrificial animal while it had all its blood. So what would happen is they had a pan underneath the altar that would collect the blood that was extracted from the sacrificial animal. And that's the picture, that's the symbolic imagery offered in Revelation, is that there's this altar, and underneath it, the martyrs cry out. It's the blood of the martyrs, just like the blood of Abel cried out from the grave. The blood of the martyrs cries out to Yahweh for justice. So, continuing, and they said to the Lord of potentates, I probably butchered that too, for he is the Lord of hosts, the God of gods, the King of kings, and the seat of his glory stands throughout the generations of the world. Your name is holy, blessed, and glorious throughout the whole world. You've made everything, and with you is the authority for everything. Everything is naked and open before your sight, and you see everything, and there's nothing that can hide itself from you. You see what Azazel has done, how he has taught all forms of oppression on the earth. Once again, all sin comes from the watchers. Obviously, with the one marked exception of Cain and Lamech killing their fellow man. And they revealed eternal secrets which are performed in heaven, and which man learned. So once again, probably not bad overall that man learned, but it's bad that they learned this way. Yahweh didn't reveal it to them. Yahweh knew humanity wasn't ready for this kind of knowledge, and it resulted in nothing but mass sin and rebellion. Yes, moreover, Semyaz, to whom you have given power to rule over his companions, cooperating. They went unto the daughters of the people on the earth, and they lay together with them, whose women, and with those women, and defiled themselves, and revealed to them every kind of sin. As for the women, they gave birth to giants to the degree that the whole earth was filled with blood and oppression. So, once again, this is an ancient Jewish account, well before Christ, in the Second Temple Jewish period, that essentially gives us all the information that Genesis 6 gives us, with a lot more detail. And as we're going to see, New Testament authors such as Peter and Jude actually tell us things that can only be gotten from this book, First Enoch. You can't get it from anywhere else in the Old Testament. So obviously they believed at least these portions of the story were true, or they wouldn't have wrote what they wrote. And we'll get to what they wrote in a minute. Quickly, there's 2 verses in chapter 10 I want to read, and 4 verses in chapter 15. So chapter 10, verses 8 and 9. Okay. And all the children of the people will not perish through all the secrets of the angels, which they taught to their sons. And the whole earth has been corrupted by Azazel's teaching for his own actions, and write upon him all sin. So all sin, the whole earth is ascribed to Azazel. It's Azazel's fault. And Gabriel said to the Lord, proceed against the bastards and reprobates, and against the children of adultery, and destroy the children of adultery, and expel the children of the watchers from among the people, and send them against one another, so that they may be destroyed in the fight, for the length of days they have not. And I'll go ahead and read this next one. They will beg you for everything for their fathers on behalf of themselves, because they hope to live an eternal life. Obviously, that's going to be denied by Yahweh. Sorry, spoiler alert. If you wanted to go ahead and read the book of Enoch, be my guest, but I kind of spoiled it for you, so sorry. First Enoch 15. I'm going to read 8 through 12. But now the giants who were born from the union of the spirits and the flesh, shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, because their dwelling shall be upon the earth and inside the earth. Evil spirits have come out of their bodies, because from that day they were created from the holy ones. They became the watchers. Their first origin is the spiritual foundation. They will become evil upon the earth, and shall be called evil spirits. And then he goes on to talk about the spiritual beings of heaven. I'll go ahead and read that. The dwelling of the spiritual beings of heaven is heaven, but the dwelling of the spirits of the earth, which are born upon the earth, is in the earth. The spirits of the giants oppress each other. They will corrupt, fall, be excited, and fall upon the earth, and cause sorrow. They eat no food, nor become thirsty, nor find obstacles. And these spirits shall rise up against the children of the people, and against the women, because they have proceeded forth from them. So, and that's all Enoch we're going to read. I won't put you through any more of it. It is very interesting, and I'm not telling you to read the whole book and say, hey, this should be in the biblical canon, this should be in our Bible. These are missing and forgotten texts rejected by the church. Don't do that. Don't be one of those people. that's not the point of this. The point of this is to say, hey, when I encounter weird stuff, one, it's to help us understand what's in Genesis chapter 6, right? Because it's an ancient Old Testament text that we're at least a few thousand years removed from. And we read stuff like this, like, what are the sons of God? And how could they procreate with human women and have giant children? And what is all this about? Well, we can read what other ancient people a lot closer to the original context heard, and what they would have thought when they read Genesis chapter 6. And that right there, that's what they thought about it. So it's one of those things where I guess if you take issue with it, don't come at me sideways, because that's what ancient Jews thought it said. That's what they think it means, or thought it meant. So if we don't agree with them, then I don't know how you can have a good reason to not agree with them. Regardless, if you disagree with that, then you're really going to disagree with what the New Testament says. So 1 Peter chapter 3, and I promise we're almost done. Trying to keep all these under an hour. I know it's just been a lot of reading, so if you notice, this isn't a whole lot of interjection by me giving my opinion or any speculation about what this stuff means. It's just, hey, Genesis chapter 6 got written sometime very early on, and First Enoch got written sometime after that, well before Christ, but well after Genesis. And that apparently was well received, because New Testament authors are going to take that information about Genesis 6 and include it in your New Testament, which is canon. So if you want to argue about Enoch, go ahead and argue, but these guys obviously thought that the portions that I just read were true enough to write what they wrote. Not to mention all the stuff we have in the Gospels about demons and unclean spirits, which once again aren't talked about in the Old Testament for a reason. So 1 Peter chapter 3, I want to read what's commonly referred to as the spirits in prison passage. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you not as a removal of dirt from the body or as a ritual cleansing, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God with the angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to him. So once again, that's the gospel. The gospel is the resurrection of the bodily resurrection of Jesus and his complete dominion over the powers of darkness. He has defeated them. They have all been subjected to him. And not just the powers of darkness, right? The powers of light willfully bow to his rule, to the rule and reign of God through his son Jesus. So those few things, obviously the whole in the days of Noah is what tells us we should look at Genesis chapter 6, right? Fair enough. And this whole, because they formerly did not obey in the days of Noah, is obviously a reference to their sin, mating with human women and creating giant children in an attempt to overthrow God's rule of the earth through his representative rulers, human beings. So we got another one, 2 Peter. So Peter apparently was a big fan of this stuff. 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. For if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell, and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness, and to be kept under the judgment. Sorry, the weird look was when I read hell in verse 4. I believe in the Greek that's Tartarus. which is not what we generally think of as hell. But anyway, we can have that discussion another time when we talk about Old Testament Sheol and how that relates to things we have in the New Testament. But yes, and he committed them to change the gloomy darkness and to be kept until the judgment. If he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ash, he condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what happens to the ungodly. Sorry, I read an extra verse there, but a note about Sodom and Gomorrah. It's probably a little bit more about the men of Sodom seeking after strange flesh, which we have referenced in the next book we're going to read, which is in Jude, and that'll be the last thing we cover. But obviously, this talks about the angels, a corporate rebellion of angels sinning against God, that is against his dominion mandate, and God judging them, that is locking them up until the day of judgment. So, which once again is exactly what we had recorded in 1st Enoch. And once again, you will not read that in Genesis chapter 6 or just about anywhere else in the Old Testament, though God does judge rebellious divine beings in Psalm 82, which once again we'll talk about later. Yeah, so one more, we'll do Jude, show how Jude covers Genesis 6 in verses, so I'm going to read verse 6 and 14 and 15. For certain people have crept in unnoticed, who long ago were designated for this condemnation, ungodly people who pervert the grace of God. Okay, that's not right. I'm in the wrong spot here. So, sorry, verse 6. And the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he is kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. Once again, like the same exact language of 2 Peter. And verse 7, just as Sodom and Gomorrah. So, even in the same order, in the same language. And then 14 and 15 of Jude, it was also about these that Enoch, the 7th from Adam, prophesied, saying, Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his holy ones, to execute judgment on all, and to convict all the ungodly of all their deeds of ungodliness they have committed in such an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things the ungodly sinners have spoken against him. And once again, you can't get that from the Old Testament, because if you go back in the Old Testament and you read about Enoch in Genesis, or try to find it anywhere else in Scripture, you can't find it because it's not there. It's only in 1st Enoch. So this prophecy that Jude refers to of Enoch, which he obviously believes is a legitimate prophecy, does not come from the Old Testament Scriptures. It comes from 1st Enoch. So, once again, at least the portions that I read from 1st Enoch are portions that New Testament authors legitimately thought were true. We should take that into account when we read Genesis chapter 6. And therefore, when we read Genesis chapter 6, in order to fully understand what's going on there and why it was such a big deal and why it was considered the second of 3 rebellions in Genesis, rebellions specifically against humanity's divine dominion mandate, we need to look at 1st Enoch and read how ancient Jews interpreted Genesis chapter 6 and what they thought that meant, in order to understand also how New Testament authors treat the same material, both Genesis 6 and 1st Enoch. And we should probably treat it the same way they treated it. So, that's the second of the 3 divine rebellions in Genesis. Please like, subscribe, and share if you found this helpful at all. Once again, this is going to help us going forward, because any mention of demons or sin of the angels or talk about the watchers or the sons of God, we're going to know what's going on, and we can just refer back to what happened in Genesis 6. So, thanks for watching, guys.